Thank you, Pam. This sounds like a very interesting project. So what I thought I would do is to talk about a particular moment in time, because I think a lot of what you're doing is dealing with crucial moments and how some of those crucial moments tend to be enlivened or activated by your contact with other people. And you've asked us to reflect a little bit on our life and time. So in terms of that, it seems a bit timely because it's only the last week or so that I was thinking along the lines of the things that you've been talking about. And I revisited some information that I'd written, a letter I'd written to my former English history teacher when I was at school, because when you asked some of the questions about influential people in your life and how they may have helped you get into education and things like that. And I was looking at a letter I'd written to my high school English teacher because I'd lost contact with him for about 30 years. And about 10 years ago I eventually made contact again. And part of this letter to him, from last year, I finished the letter by talking about a question I was asked when I was interviewing for my current position. I currently teach at Teachers College, Columbia University. I interviewed for the position here about 10 years ago. And in a graduate seminar, a student asked me about why I seem to be so committed to teaching. And I kind of told a story about my English history teacher from high school days. I said because he was the person who literally changed my life, and we often have those kinds of stories. And I said the tragedy is he doesn't know it, or I don't think he does know it. And at that stage I hadn't been in contact with him. But very soon after that, because I come from Sydney, Australia, I was able to contact him, and since then, the last 10 years, we've had these ongoing conversations. And the letter that I'd written to him about a year ago, it's all about, it started with me reiterating some of those things that touched me as a kid, because I come from a very working class family. No one in my family ever went beyond grade 9. And I didn't intend to either, except when I reached grade 10, which in Australia you could do an exam and leave and generally go into apprentice into trades. And because I grew up in a small town of 300 in the country, most people basically just did trades in the local railroad industry or in a lot of the industries related to wheat and sheep in farming. My father was a house painter by trade, which was the trade that I had when I was in high school to get me through high school, and has served me well ever since. But I was expected to basically leave and take a trade. I decided to stay on for one more year at school. I thought I'll do grade 11 because it looked to me like, and I talk about this in this letter to this high school teacher because I wanted to, he knew my motives were not so honourable in going on to school, but because it seemed to me that I could go to school in grade 11, I could continue to play football, which was my main passion, and it looked like it was not too much of too difficult. And then I could leave without having to go through all the rigours of trying to finish high school. I didn't anticipate coming across this guy, and somehow something happened. What has been interesting for us to compare our conversations over the years was that I never knew he knew so much about me. And in this letter I was talking about moments, because most of this letter is about me struggling to get more than 8 out of 10 for an essay of one of his tasks, which I never ever did. But part of that process was that I developed an extraordinary respect for this guy. He somehow cued me into language, the beauties of language. But it manifests itself in all sorts of interesting ways, because when I met up with him for the first time about 10 years ago, we visited him. He was rather elderly, and he brought out a folder that he had in his own files. And in that folder he had a copy of a painting that I did when I was in high school. This really bad adolescent angst. Not only was the painting rife with all the kind of frustrations of an adolescent. But I also wrote a really, really bad essay about that as well. And this guy had copies of them. So he made copies for me. And the artwork itself, it was part of my major project at the end of grade 12. And it was a painting called "But We by a Love So Much Refined." And it's a line from the poetry of John Donne. And of course John Donne was one of the many poets that this guy opened me up to. And the other part of that story was that, of course, you know, Mary and I have been hanging around for a long time, and we met while we were in school, and we've been hanging out ever since. She was the A grade student who was supposed to continue on to grade 12, but she had more ambitions. She went to secretarial college, and that was the line of work that she mapped out for herself, and I stayed on at school, much to the chagrin of my school teachers, except for this guy. So that poetry comes from some of my teenage angst. And the funny part about that story was that these artworks that you did as a major piece in grade 12, there was a part of it, there was a history exam, and there was an art production piece. So these paintings were, and other artworks you did, were sent away for examination in the city. Something must have been okay, because I eventually got a scholarship to go to art school. But when I met this guy years later, he was living in Sydney. He'd retired, but he was working with the art examiners in Sydney, helping unpack all these artworks, because this still goes on. And he just happened to connect up with a good friend of mine whose name is John Dunn, who's a publisher, who was also an art teacher. And this was how I eventually connected up with John Turner from school. So what John Turner did, my English history teacher, he took my artwork, copy of my artwork, in about 1988, to the marking in Sydney, and all of my friends who were art teachers saw this thing that I did in 1969, so they all graded it, and they gave me scathing comments on my pathetic life as an adolescent, as depicted in my my John Donne inspired artwork. But that's a kind of a roundabout way of sort of giving some sense of these powerful things that happen, and what has been joyous has been continuing to communicate with my teacher over these many years, in a response that he'd, after I'd written to him talking about some of these points, he then writes back to me and he says, "Your story with yourself and Mary is cherished among my many school mementos. And I'm glad as you are that you backed up for year 11, irrespective of your original motives. I soon saw that you were a dopey, dozy fellow who needed to be kept up to mark by constant prodding and biting sarcasm. Somehow the magic of language survived it all." So this kind of cycle, the way that we take influence from others, but then we all sometimes we don't realise that the others also take this in their own way. And he gave me a wonderful line in this, because he finishes by saying his experience at that small country town was some of the most memorable in his teaching career. And he said that's what happened when teaching becomes reaching, which was a lovely way of commenting on what he saw as his impact on me. And I had cause to use that phrase recently, where I was writing for a book about Maxine Green, where people write letters to Maxine Green, and I wrote a letter documenting some of the ways that she's impacted on me, and it was titled "When Teaching Becomes Reaching," and I cite my English history teacher as being the source of that sort of thinking. Partly wonderful opportunism, circumstance. I would never have thought that I would ever be involved in teaching or education. I was mostly interested in a fast buck and trying to survive, I guess. the fact that I was able to get a scholarship to go to art school meant I had to leave the small country town to go to the city. Mary promptly followed, so we ended up getting married when I was first year undergraduate and had a couple of kids by the time I'd finished as an undergrad. And of course they create a different kind of an environment in terms of the sorts of things that you do. And it was during that time when I was at art school learning to become a secondary high school teacher that the seriousness of what this enterprise was really started to take root. Very difficult to separate it from life because if you've got a young family and you're a student and all of those things that impact on how you grow get wrapped around a certain seriousness of intent, which is part serious but also part survival. Because when you're just living off scholarship money and things like that without any support from family, it becomes a bit tight. But again, when I was an undergrad, I was able to had an opportunity to continue on into a fifth year, an honours year, and there were two reasons why I did that. One was that I became completely fascinated by that stage by teaching and education and art in particular. It was a time this was in the early 70s in Australia when there was a radical political change in the country. We'd just changed from a Conservative government to a left-wing government for the first time in 25 years. There was a real enthusiasm for what it was to be having a sense of identity, a sense of self as a country, still tied closely to Britain, but for most of us of my generation it was about moving beyond that because it was clear that post World War II we were more aligned with America rather than Britain. A lot of our culture, a lot of our measures of success tend to be gauged according to American connections rather than British connections. We were content just to beat Britain at rugby and cricket, which wasn't too difficult. More difficult was measuring up within a different set of criteria in a massive culture like America. But it also gave you a very clear sense of identity in the sense of that there were things that you had to offer and the things that you wanted to work on. It was also a time of some radical school reform. I was completely fascinated by the development of community schools and radical school reform. A lot of it coming out of literature from America in the late 60s, early 70s. Ivan Illich, Neil Postman, teaching as a subversive activity. I identified with a lot of those. And in Australia, you get pockets of these things flourishing, particularly in the development of radical schools, coming out of church halls and communities, and so I did a study of those areas, particularly interested in the way that the arts contribute to those. So by the time I was finishing my undergrad, and then the opportunity to go on and do an extra year, part of it was driven by the sense that there was another world out there, and this was when, as an undergrad, I was becoming very familiar with the literature and art education from this country, because it was really non-existent in Australia. This thing called art education, plenty of art, plenty of education, but not so much this stuff where you bring it together. My other reason was that I just wanted to hang around having a non-9 to 5 job while my second son was in his first year of life, the same as I was in my first one. So we did a lot of hanging out together in painting studios, and he used to cover a lot of paint because I was in my splash and dribble days at that time. So the educational interest got cemented in those times more by circumstance. There wasn't really any particular influential individual at that point. Mostly I found my influence through connections through reading and writing. I found it a bit provincial when I was there. And maybe that was a fact that I thought I was probably a little bit more mature than a lot of my colleagues, and partly that was because of my seriousness of interest, but also the responsibility you bring on when you've got a family. It's not that you can sort of slouch off for summer vacations and when you have to go and paint houses or something. So it was a different balance, and the next kind of critical point of time in that evolution into those areas of teaching was that when I left, I finished my my undergraduate work, and then I became a secondary high school art teacher working in the inner city of Sydney and then some of the outer suburbs. And during those, and I did that for 4 years, and again, one of your questions asks about some of the difficulties, and like most of us, our difficulties as we move from student to teacher tends to be the realities of trying to establish yourself within those environments. And the 2 years in inner city all boys school of students for whom English was not their first language, a lot of students coming from certainly from the Middle East, and we're talking about young kids from the ages of 14 to 17, sometimes being sent back home to be involved in some of the struggles that they were involved in, whether in Lebanon or parts of that area. So we very much live the politics of the time, but what you're trying to do is create something of a sanctuary whereby language is really not a precondition, because often you could be doing things in different arts forms that still allowed you to produce, and that become the arena for them to construct their language and to pick up their skills in English and things like that. But they're also pretty tough kids, and what you find is you become very good at figuring out how to survive. One of my advantages was that I could still remember what it was like to be a real active, sometimes angry 13-year-old, because it very much related to some of my education. So I could I found myself being able to anticipate what kids were going to do in certain ways, but then you also learn all these other skills about attention span and having 10 different things in your back pocket to pull out at any particular point of time. But of course you learn a massive amount very quickly. I had the benefit of working for some very interesting colleagues and some people that I still am very strong friends with. One I brought over to TC a few years ago, Graeme Blondell, who was my first art teacher, the art master in the school that I was teaching at. So certain connections in the teaching field will sustain over a long period of time. So we still laugh about... He still tells the story of coming into one of my classes and finding me having a very detailed, intensive drawing lesson, and the student sitting at the front, but he was tied up with about 30 foot of rope with a gag, and he was one of the most notorious students in the school. And I, with a straight face, explained that we were pretending that he'd been involved it was a bank manager involved in a robbery, and we're all drawing all the shapes between the rope as the child struggled to get out. And my teacher walked in and took one look and just raised his eyebrows and turned around and says, "I didn't see any of this." But you do what you do. Certainly a little bit different. So your influential factors tend to be, again, as I said, circumstance, opportunity, the ways that you craft that, the teaching in schools. I felt I learnt almost enough about teaching within about 4 years. That I felt comfortable enough. Maybe I was a bit overconfident, but I then was able to. I applied for other positions, working more of a consultancy role, working with people in the field, elementary school teachers, secondary school teachers, and that was the environment that rekindled a lot of interest that I had when I was an undergraduate, about wanting to explore these fields in much greater detail. So by the time that I worked as a consultant for about 4 or 5 years, working basically essentially in professional development, it was time to go back to my studies. And again, that's another story of an interesting set of connections with individuals. So one of the dilemmas I had, and I'm sure many of us have, when we go teaching, becoming an art teacher, is trying to then figure out how you're bridging those roles between the kind of art practice you're doing when you're an undergrad and the kind of attention that you were getting. Because like most of us, I was exhibiting in shows, and I thought, okay, I can kind of make this in some way, but I also need to teach to do all the other things that we need to do. So that sort of dilemma about what roles you take on, and of course those become somewhat stereotypes, and you confront them all the time when you're an undergraduate, because part of your teaching fraternity are telling you to become serious as an artist, so you need to give up this teaching stuff and concentrate on it. And some others are saying no, it's teaching is incredibly important at all sorts of levels, but you have to find it out for yourself. So in working in schools for several years and then working with teachers, where my connection then was through teachers and through professional development, particularly non-specialist teachers in elementary schools, trying to deal with when they ask you those questions. Well, why is it important for children to be involved in this stuff? And what you have to do is then be able to dig deep, because you can't just simply rely on quotes, because it's got to be something that they have to be able to see value in. So you become a good advocate, and it becomes easy to be an advocate if you believe in it. And part of the phrase that I kind of took from that era is something that I continue to talk about, which is essentially what's my job? Well, I'm a teacher. My job is to excite others about art. Someone did it for me at a certain point. They found something that was very basic to who I am and what I do, and they allowed me to get a sense that maybe there's ways that you can move with this. So, as I said, a small kid I was a small kid in a small country town, for whom the arts are certainly not anywhere near the level of acceptance that I was known more for my football ability than any my art ability. So you continue to deal with these sorts of questions, and while I was working as a consultant and dealing with these questions with some of my colleagues, it really allowed me to think seriously about the field of education, but also seriously about what did I bring to it in terms of my art practice, not just my pedagogical practice. But also led me to realise that I needed much more opportunity to dig deeper into this. So I picked up some correspondence with some American universities, and because in a sense there was no opportunity in Australia to do the kinds of things I was interested in. I didn't want to do anything to do with drawing in Australia in the 30s or educational psychology. I wanted this thing about what is it when people get excited about art and then they do things within their institutions or communities to allow us to emphasise the significance of it. It was obvious that there was a whole bunch of literature, a whole bunch of people in this country that had grown particularly since the 50s and 60s, that were establishing powerful programs. It was interesting that I eventually chose to go to a program that was for reasons of individuals rather than the nature of what they could offer. I still have. I struck up correspondence with the chair of the Department of Art Education at Ohio State University, one of many universities I looked at in terms of the programs. Ohio State and the chair, Ken Morantz, was the only place that I received a letter that wasn't a form letter, and through the subsequent correspondence with Ken, the bottom line in one of his letters, when we're talking about coming across to do a master's, his comment was that if you're silly enough to want to come across here with a wife and 2 young kids, we're probably interested in you. And in a way, it kind of set the scene for what this was about, because it wasn't really about whether you'd get scholarships or what it was going to cost. It was I was able to win a scholarship in Australia to give me 12 months leave on full salary, so I was able to use that to make my initial move. But once I arrived at Ohio State, one interesting thing happened was that I actually found out I knew a little bit more than I thought. It's just that graduate school provides you with a chance to kind of add a few new coat hangers to your closet and to rearrange some of the stuff that you have, and then to figure out then which bits that you don't have. So, and the people like Ken Moran's the chair, and Arthur Effland, who I was particularly interested in his work, were able to do those sorts of things, that they provide you with enough challenge for you to be able to figure out what you need to do. And those two became very influential in the kinds of things that I did. Once I got there on my year's leave, I swore that I wouldn't leave until I went further. And we, as a family, we committed to this. We committed to a 3-year pact. Said, okay, the youngest guy's Ben had to start elementary school, and it was a 3-year gig before he then would go to middle school. For Brett, he started middle school, which was a new concept for him. And after 3 years, he would then go to high school. So I was kind of given 3 years to do what I could do. And I became completely obsessed. And when you get obsessed about the kinds of knowledge that is opening up for you, and more importantly, how you're recrafting that, you kind of become unstoppable. And that opportunity is something that's stuck with me a lot, particularly now that I work with graduate students, and trying to figure out where is the point that I can help sort of identify this opportunity and challenge in a way that the student has to find for themselves, and how can I construct an environment that allows them the flexibility but also the responsibility to kind of find that, and then to move with it, because it happened to me. As I said, I became completely obsessive, but I also had the benefit of living with an extraordinary woman who was able to kind of take a lot of the pressure off in some way, and I just kind of went 24/7. So I was able to finish a doctorate and a master's within 3 years, and get that in such a way that it laid extraordinary foundations. Because the other third person in that set of connections of influential people was Howard Gardner, because I became very much enamoured with the kinds of things that he was doing at Project Zero in the late 70s, early 80s. And Arthur Effland tells a story to some of his students, and he was telling some of the students at Teachers College when he was visiting here a couple of weeks ago, about how he was somewhat surprised at this brash Australian when I mentioned that I thought I should write to Howard Gardner to ask him some questions, and Arthur was saying that, well, that's probably not the way that we do things here. We kind of build up our profile and our knowledge, and I knew that. I knew that we had to kind of do that, but I thought, no, there's some important questions I need to ask this guy, and I said, the worst thing, he can ignore me. But Howard didn't ignore me. He wrote back to me quite quickly, and we started a connection which eventually led to all my doctoral work, which generated out of stuff that he was doing. However, it looked at some of the work that Howard was doing, but it also challenged it, because when we put a lot of the material to empirical test, it fell apart. He was incredibly supportive of that, and we've been having this kind of conversations now since the early 80s about the sort of the uncertainty and certainty of what happens when you construct these new forms of knowledge, and then you put them out there in the field and see how it sort of comes back. So that, in a way, that set me in place for a lot of the areas that I'm interested in. And for me, it gave me my grounding kind of theoretically, conceptually. It gave me some links into how I might see the field of art education. And it also raised the bar a bit in answering that question, am I an artist or an art educator? Am I a teacher? And when I felt I had enough of a grounding in the field that I could have conversations with scholars, that I could publish material, that I could participate in the field, it wasn't enough. I needed to be able to look at that field for what it could be rather than what it was. One of the things that I found, one of the benefits of being an outsider into a system, coming into the American system, is that you get to look at it being conscious of its history, but not limited by where it might go. Because I was, when I finished graduate school at Ohio, I had to go back to Australia to pay off my debts, and but my intellectual connections were always with this country and with the colleagues here. So I became something of a peripatetic art educator for the next 10 or 15 years, moving back and forth at different points of time, coming over here to re-ground myself, but all the time looking at the nature of the field and being able to use my external capacity as a bit of a guerrilla tactician, not unlike football strategy sometimes, where you kind of pull back and then you figure out another way around the defence or whatever. Because I'm incredibly enthused by the potential of what it is, that this business that we're in, but I tend to not get too impressed sometimes with the politics of how we feel we have to construct ourselves within the systems that things that happen around us. So we have to be very clear about who we are and what we do, to be able to convince others that this is important, an important human enterprise. That part never changes. What gets better as we become more articulate in what we do, and in taking on that quest of trying to build a much more comprehensive arts education for me, I just found that I found that whenever I was asking myself certain questions, whether they were questions that come out of education, because when I went back to Australia I spent about 10 years working in curriculum theory, writing syllabuses for high schools and all of that kind of stuff that we were doing, happening around the globe, looking at these sort of K-12 programs, integrated arts, and all of those areas that we find that we continue, as we continue to try to craft the architecture of what we do in schools to make it better, but then often building systems that are very elaborate but sometimes lose certain basic points, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in the process of doing that, in the process of looking at my knowledge sources and my knowledge systems, I kept going back to one particular source all the time, and that really never changed, and that was contemporary art. And I found whenever I was looking for sustenance, whenever I was looking for challenge, when I was looking for somebody to question some of the basic assumptions, I would always find a conversation with contemporary artists. The thing about contemporary art is you can't fake it. When it happens and it's then presented in whatever formats, whether it's in exhibitions, galleries, you bear your soul. And while the business of art is that others might pick this up and run with it, be they critics or historians or cultural theorists, ultimately that speaks to the power of art to generate these conversations. It doesn't make the art better or worse. It simply allows us to understand the rich complexity of what it is. And at the heart of it are humans doing things, humans doing very interesting things. So that part was always centre to where I found these bits leading. And it became much easier for me then to, in a way, rationalise my roles. I didn't have to apologise for being involved in art education or being involved in teaching. In no way. What it allowed me to do was to open up these conversations in many ways, in most extraordinary ways. So towards the end of the 80s, when I was doing a reference book on art for high school kids, when I looked at all the material that was around, I noticed there was a lot of people writing books about art for kids, for high school, and I thought call them kids, but for high school students, that were, in a way, masking out the voice of the artist. Often what we do as teachers, we feel it's our role to interpret and pass it on. So we will help explain to the others we're teaching with what this is about. And I found that kind of curious. So part of the task then was doing a lot of work with artists, just doing exactly what you're doing. Sitting down with them and having conversations and asking them about their art, asking them about their life, and then, of course, finding things that you're finding. Finding when you're talking to very successful contemporary artists that many of them will say, well, there was this art teacher that I had when I was, in grade school. So certain things will keep bubbling to the surface. And when you document this, and then some kid in a small country town reads that this famous artist they know loved doing cartoons when he was 10 years old, and grew up in a small country town, you start to get certain resonances and certain connections. So I found that when I was doing that work, getting back in touch with the people who are involved in the production of this material, and then allowing them to talk about it, in a way, as the teacher middleman, I was able to participate in a three-way conversation rather than feeling as if I was a cipher. My job was to be able to write it in such a way that I could invite the students in to these conversations. And again, for me, it was the first time that I started to realise that art, in terms of its power as a language, has a lot to offer. Excuse me. And the rich conversations almost happen as a consequence of some event or some impact. So you don't need to choreograph a lot of it up front. You've just got to be very astute and smart about what you do with it in follow-up. And that might not lend itself neatly to things like prescribed objectives or expected outcomes, but it does a lot if you're interested in unanticipated outcomes and then what you do with those. So whether it gets translated into kind of curriculum rhetoric or whether it gets translated into pedagogical practice, putting that sort of art making central to thinking is something that I've been very much committed to, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years. It linked in with some of my early interests in things like streetworks. So they started when I was a visiting scholar at Harvard Grad School in the late 80s, early 90s. I came across as a visiting scholar for 6 months, and like my previous trip, I ended up staying for a couple of years because I ended up working for Howard Gardner as a consultant on some of his research projects. So we picked up our conversation in a much more practical way about 10 years after the dissertation, and had a lot of wonderful conversations again, which have continued. But while I was there, living in a small apartment for a couple of years, just not having access to a place to make art, I found I just needed to, and that's when I started to simply make things from material I drag in from the street, and borrow a few tools from some friends, hammer and pair of pliers and things like that, and very rudimentary materials. And the streets, of course, are just wonderful repositories of stuff, things that people discard. So that's where the street work started, and by the time I'd finished my couple of years there, I'd amassed probably there's about a dozen or more pieces of work, and these varied. Some were quite large, but the characteristic for all of them was a lot of time was spent on each one. They were not simply getting junk and then playing around with it a bit. It's consciously turning it into other things depending on circumstances and event. So we decided to have an exhibition before we left to go back to Australia, and the exhibition meant taking these pieces back out into the street and installing them around Boston in places that looked like that's where they should be. And they range from outside of the Raytheon missile company on the outskirts of Boston that were in, because we're talking about the first Iraq War here, and the Patriot missile, which is too delicious a word not to critique, through to the politics of the Bill Clinton era. So works had some overly political references to them, so it was important then to simply put them back out in the street. And there's a whole wonderful slew of stories that come out of these pieces, and we simply set out an invitation of an exhibition, but the venues were all over Boston. And if you could find them, you could have them. And that set in place a long process that I continue to do when I'm working, whether I'm in other cities or here in New York. This process of taking material that has histories that you don't know about, but responding to certain properties and qualities, and then putting it together with circumstance, whether it's political, whether it's situational, whether I'm in Tokyo or Beijing or wherever. And then wrapping that around story, event, producing something, living with that thing for a certain period of time, putting it on a white wall for a while, putting in an exhibition, but ultimately knowing that it's got a certain kind of an energy that doesn't stop with the completion of a work, because works are never completed. And then eventually finding places to put them back out in the environment, and just letting them go, which sometimes is a bit tough, but the revelation for me, in a sense, was that this is what you do when you're teaching, because you invest in others, and you create an opportunity where it's part circumstance, part richness of material. Things happen, and then it goes out there, and you know what happens to it. My teacher from GNE took 30 years. I did find out that he did know that he had made an impact, but generally you don't. So the idea that art, again, it can be a vehicle for this kind of communication. The thing I like about it is the uncertainty. I like not knowing, and that pattern of working as an art educator has continued. So the sort of the genesis of the art practice, it started to come together in those early days in Boston, and there was another 10 years or so before I arrived at Teachers College. I'd met some of the folks from Teachers College in the 90s when I was working at Boston, because Project Zero was doing a collaborative project with Teachers College, working with the Lincoln Centre. So I became a consultant to some of those projects. So I met some of my colleagues in the early 90s. So it seemed appropriate 10 years later that I should return on a more permanent basis. And it gave me a chance to come back, to do things that we'd set in place over the years but never really brought to full fruition. During the time in Australia, with the children growing up and going to university and literally taking on their own careers, we did a lot of work nationally with the field. Had a lot more. We had graduate programs in the universities that were growing. I was getting master's students and a small number of doctoral students. So the field was growing itself, but I needed a bigger canvas on which to play, and in a way a more intensive environment, and a greater number of people to work with, which brought us back in a way to New York, and we knew that it would be a substantial time. We've been here about 10 years, and at the moment there's no immediate plans to there's nowhere else that we want to be at the moment. Teachers College opened up all sorts of other opportunities. I brought to that environment quite a clear sense of who I was and the sorts of things that I was interested in. My own criticisms with the field and where it was moving, my own views on how we need to think of the field, dealing with the specificity of what was local and immediate in terms of schooling, but what was also broader culturally, philosophically, because we're talking about the sort of the move into the 21st century now. So our necessity to think beyond what's immediately within our orbit is critical. So the opportunity to work with an extraordinary bunch of students from all sorts of different life experiences, and to provide the same opportunity I had, which was to really set the challenge in place. I've always been very impressed by Maxine Green's comment that art can't change the world, but it can change someone who can. And I very quickly realised that the difficulties that we're confronted with within local schools in, say, New York City, and the kinds of histories that schools have to deal with, the histories of funding, the way that the system's organised rather beautifully to keep inequity very much in place. They were some questions that were much would take people much smarter than me to try and deal with. And they were ones that the whole communities need to solve. So our best bet was to provide an opportunity to develop the best possible individuals with the sharpest critical minds who are able to apply their own way of responding to these challenges, because this stuff doesn't get templated. There's any kind of model or strategy is going to be redundant very quickly. But what's not going to be redundant is one of the questions that you have on your list, which is what's the most important aspect of education that sometimes gets neglected or doesn't quite work, or what are one of the difficulties that we tend to be ignoring. And it really comes back to about what it is to be human. You're talking about this extraordinary resource, the human mind, and that human mind which kicks in, right from the get-go, and it just never stops. Research is telling us now that even people my age and older, it doesn't mean that you're not producing brain cells. It's use it or lose it, and the opportunity for, the opportunity for the arts to take leading roles here, because many of my generation, the baby boomer generation, that are now facing those, in a way, the uncertainties of what it is to be, part of the elder generation. Those that have been involved in processes whereby they've had to create their own environment and had to respond by creating an understanding for themselves about who they are and what they do, in a way you're never then threatened by uncertainty. You're not afraid of it. So that if the physical circumstances or the fiscal circumstances or the community circumstances are sometimes taken out of your control, that doesn't mean that you can't survive. Because you have a facility of able to deal with those situations, because you're continually creating ways of thinking about those and doing things. That part never stops. There was a study done a couple of years ago of elder artists in New York from ages 75 onwards called Above Ground, which was a comment by one of the women when they were asked how long she's going to continue to be an artist, and she said, well, whenever I'm above ground. But the thing about people involved in the arts, you never retire. And there's a lot to be learnt from others about what it is to be in control of those kinds of creative capacities. So the way that I look at that in terms of the work that I do at a place like Teachers College, where I get to work with some extraordinary students, that sometimes the system's not so extraordinary, but the students themselves are really a powerful cohort, because they bring to a program all sorts of skills and life experiences that are not easily partitioned into different institutional systems that we create. So it's not as if someone's life experience now gets partitioned into history and philosophy and social science and arts. It's wrapped around a whole set of life experiences. So what you need to be able to do as an instructor in this environment is to provide an opportunity to allow others, the students, to first of all become very powerfully aware of what it is that makes them tick and how they think, so that when they need to take on board those other areas, those other languages, the languages of theory and the language of research, whatever the languages are required to do the kind of work we need to do in this graduate environment, they're the languages that are going to assist to take it to other levels. But those languages are all going to be centred around this thing that gets you up in the morning and continues to enthrall you as you paint or draw or make things and stick them out in the street.